Welcome to Pleasurology Island. I'm Free Thought Steve, the lone pleasurologist. Thanks for stopping by. Welcome to another meeting of the pioneers of pleasurology, where we're all trying to figure out what is the best way to make human life as enjoyable as it possibly can be. That's our mission statement here. So, last time I was beginning to tell you a little bit about my own personal sexual history. And I feel like this is an important thing to do because, first of all, as I've told you before, I wouldn't say a founding member of the original First Wave Psychedelic Counterculture, but I was certainly a participating member of the first wave of the psychedelic counterculture, and I have never renounced my allegiance to the psychedelic counterculture. I am still an unreconstructed hippie. I've never taken the oath of allegiance to straight society. I've lived in straight society without being part of it as much as I could, staying a little bit detached. And now, the point of my making these videos now is to try and continue the tradition of the counterculture, the psychedelic counterculture, so that whatever information I can pass along will be available to those of you who are out there somewhere ready to be the next wave of the psychedelic counterculture. And so I'm just sending you a message in a bottle, basically, of what I've learned in my life, becoming a member of the psychedelic counterculture. And then when the psychedelic counterculture basically disappeared and dispersed throughout mainstream culture, and I was left on my own pretty much, except for a few friends, I continued my explorations of pleasurology, which is what I discovered during the counterculture years. I got introduced to some pleasurology exercises in 1972. That's 53 years ago. And I've been doing them ever since. And during that period of time, that became sort of the central focus of my life. Learning how to feel as good as possible, as much of the time as possible. How to enjoy my cannabis high as much as possible, how to enjoy my sex drive as much as possible for as long as possible, as much of the time as possible, and to have ecstatic, highly euphoric, pre-orgasmic, extended sexual bliss, where sexual bliss filled my entire consciousness for long periods of time, long as I wanted, and then finish up when I was ready to finish with a cosmic orgasm, an oceanic orgasm, a full consciousness, full body orgasm, the 100% orgasm, beyond which there is no other orgasm because you've used 100% of your consciousness to have it in. And so you've had the best possible orgasm that your pleasure system can possibly provide. And that's my goal in these videos, is to help you learn to develop your own potential for sexual pleasure to its 100%, which is like a far more than just sort of your normal potential for orgasm. See, that's what I didn't realize when I first started doing pleasurology, was how much it is possible to go beyond our normal, ordinary experience of orgasm and experience really ultimate orgasms, ultra orgasms. And when I discovered that, I said, well, you know, first of all, this deserves a Nobel Prize, no question about it. But it involves cannabis. It involves yoga and relaxation and Zen meditation. It involves emotional catharsis. And so I could never run an experiment and teach my method of pleasurology to a group of people who were willing to spend the time and energy to learn it and practice it. I never had that opportunity. So I couldn't actually, validate my theory scientifically the way that I would have liked to do. I ran a scientific experiment with one subject, that was me. And it was what you call a longitudinal study. You see, you can either do a short study with a lot of people, teach them pleasurology, for 6 weeks, and then have a 3-month follow-up, a 6-month follow-up, and 1-year follow-up, and see whether they're still, having a good time or not. That's a sort of a cross-section experiment, and that would be wonderful to do. But I didn't have the resources to do that. All I had was me and my own pleasure generating all I had was me and my own pleasure generating system, and fortunately cannabis I was able to get a hold of my entire life, even though I took 10 years off because I was wrecking my lungs by smoking. And I took 10 years off, and it wasn't until I found a way to get edible cannabis legally here in my state. And now, of course, cannabis is completely legal in my state. And so, I have 10 different cannabis stores, to choose from within 5 minutes drive from my house. And that would have been a dream to me when I was a hippie, me and all my friends, back in 1967 and 68, when one of my buddies got busted for selling pot to folks who were under 18. He was over 18, and he had been in the Navy already. He was about 20 or 21. And he sold some cannabis. He was a cannabis missionary, basically. He's the one who turned me on to cannabis. And he turned on a bunch of high school kids in the town where we lived. And one of them turned out to be a narc, a young man who was still in high school, who had made it his life's mission. He wanted to have a feeling of purpose in life and to feel like a hero. And that was to try and bust as many people as he possibly could, including members of his own high school class, who then didn't get to graduate with everybody else because this was just a month or two before graduation. And my buddy got convicted and sentenced to 5 years to life, for selling pot to high school kids back in 1968, 69, somewhere in there. He ended up doing 3 years in jail, became the librarian at a nice, pleasant correctional facility in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada, and actually had a real good time. And it kind of helped him get more serious about life. And after that, he came out and did very well with the rest of his life. But anyway, that was a whole different time period. So pleasurology involves having the best sexual arousal that we can have and the best orgasms that we can have while remaining as relaxed as possible. And that's a sort of a concept that I don't think most people put together, is sexual arousal and relaxation. And part of being relaxed, when you're sexually aroused and being sexually active, whether it's by yourself or with a partner, or more than one partner, whether it's in person or virtually over the internet or something, or on the phone or whatever, part of enjoying the situation, the sexual situation, as much as possible, is to be relaxed in that situation, to be relaxed with ourself, and to be approving of our own activity, and relaxed with our partner and approving of our partner's activity. So feeling no guilt or anxiety, but feeling quite innocent in our sexual pleasure, that we're not committing a crime by being sexually active, giving ourselves and each other sexual pleasure, And unfortunately, historically, we're coming out of a culture which for thousands of years has, in fact, regarded sexual pleasure as a crime, as a sin, as something worthy of punishment, punishment forever, in a really uncomfortably warm environment. That's the culture we're coming out of. That's the received culture, the Christian culture, based on the whole delusional worldview, which is Christianity, which is like all other religions. They are all delusional worldviews, and the delusion that they all share is that they can know the mind of God. That we as human beings, that any of us, can know the mind of the universe without being able to actually meet the universe in person and ask questions and say, how do you actually feel about this? Is there any, how do you really want us to behave or not? We can't know that. We can't dial up 1-800-ASK-GOD. That's GODD, because you need to have the right number of digits there. 1-800-ASK-GOD. What do you think about sexual pleasure, God? We can't do that. But our culture has taught us that if we could do that, that God would say, oh, I think sexual pleasure is a terrible thing. That's why I invented it. I invented it and made it as pleasurable as possible so that I could tempt you into doing something that I don't like, so that I could punish you for doing that. And all of that is because I love you so much. Okay, that's what our culture has told us for thousands of years, and it peaked in the Victorian era before 1900, and it continued on into the first half of the 20th century, being the dominant attitude towards sex, that sex was the sin of lust, and any sex outside of marriage was sinful and deserving of punishment by being sent to hell forever. And sex inside marriage was something that you should never talk about and do, as inconspicuously as possible and be ashamed of it, but you did it because, you had to have children. And that was the attitude until the sexual revolution came along. And this was it was the psychedelics that made the sexual revolution fully possible, because the psychedelics enable us to step back from the culture that we're living in, that we take for granted because we've grown up in it, but to step back from it and look at it and say, that's crazy, and that's crazy, and that's not crazy, but it's no fucking fun. And yet that's what we're supposed to do all the time, which is work. But anyway, it's crazy to punish people for enjoying their sexuality, their natural sex drive. And it's crazy to make people wear clothes all the time. I mean, that's one of the things that I think very often occurs to people when they're having a psychedelic trip, particularly on one of the heavy psychedelics, is like, why am I wearing clothes? Why am I covering my body? Why am I doing this? I like my body. I should be able to, it's my body. It's nobody else's body. Nobody else should tell me I have to keep my body covered if I don't want to keep it covered. If I feel better walking around naked, that's the way I want to walk around. And it's my body. Nobody else should have anything to say against that. I read in a book of interviews with some of the original hippies from San Francisco, the counterculture people there, that one woman dropped acid and went out to the redwoods out near Big Sur, south of San Francisco, and went out lying in the woods and just took off all her clothes there, to be out there in the woods completely naked, to be one with nature, and just to, have her body completely free and unencumbered. And she stayed there for quite a long time. I think she may have, become sexually aroused and masturbated there out in the open and enjoying the freedom of masturbating in the open air, which is really something everyone should experience. The freedom of masturbating in the open air was one of my favorite experiences from the Pinecrest Drama Workshop that summer in 1972. I found myself a rock where I could, it was a big rock, so I could be up about 20 feet above the valley floor around me where the trail was. And so that people could walk by on the trail underneath and not have any idea what was going on top of this huge boulder. Some glacier must have brought it there and dropped it. There's no other way it would have gotten there. And it was like flat on top. So it was a perfect place to go up there and stretch out a towel and get my Penthouse magazine out and my massage oil and my little hash pipe, and have a little smoke and get high and be out in the beauties of nature, completely naked, looking at naked women in a magazine, the best I could do in 1972, but at least they were showing their pubic hair, which they hadn't been doing a few years before. So I was just, and the blue sky overhead and the sunshine up there, and it's like I'm masturbating in front of God and the entire universe because I'm not ashamed of masturbating. All I'm doing is taking care of my own natural biological sex drive and giving myself as much pleasure as I possibly can. And I think that's a good thing. I think that the universe, if it has any attitude toward me at all, approves of my using my own sex drive to create as much pleasure as possible. But to get back to the young counterculture woman from San Francisco, from the Haight-Ashbury, who was out in the woods in Big Sur. After she came out of the woods, she said the wind came along and told me it was time to go. So the wind came up and blew across her body, and she felt like, okay, time to go. So she went back out to the highway and was just walking back along the highway, heading back towards San Francisco, and everything was wonderful. And she hadn't bothered to put her clothes back on. So, eventually someone comes along, and instead of saying, hi, do you need a ride? I hate to see you walking out barefoot by the side of the road there. Can I help you get where you're going? No, the person who comes along is the police, and they take her to jail, for being naked on the highway, because it's such an unconventional thing to do, although she was not hurting anybody. Although I suppose it's conceivable she could have been a traffic hazard because some drivers would come along, and wouldn't be paying attention to what was going on the road, and so I suppose she could have been considered a traffic hazard, but in any case, they shouldn't have locked her up in jail for just walking around in the state in which she was born. That's why the French call it au naturel, in the natural state, of not having any clothes on at all, which of course is the state I was in with my mom in the bathtub, as I was telling you about last time. And I decided to stage my own little penis pride parade, one-person penis pride parade, and showed my penis to her in the bathtub when we were both naked there. And I told you that I thought everything was great. I thought everything was fine. We were having a good time. She was sitting there naked and facing me, and I was looking at her naked breasts, and she was, I think, enjoying me, being able to show me her beautiful naked body. She was never shy about her body. And, she just didn't expect that I was actually going to get physically or emotionally turned on, and decided to push down on the bottom of the tub with my hands and feet and lift up the middle of my body so that my penis came up to the surface of the water, and the water was just splashing around my little penis there as it lay up on my tummy there, and I was showing it to my mommy because, I have a nice body too. Mommy has a beautiful body. She's showing it to me. Well, I want to show my body to mommy too. And my emotional brain had already sensed, I was 3.5, my emotional brain was well developed enough to recognize this as the kind of situation that it's appropriate to become sexually aroused in. If you're naked with a beautiful woman, it's appropriate to become sexually aroused. You know, even though I was only 3.5 years old, that didn't mean that my emotional brain had a sexiness recognition center which was focused on 3.5-year-old girls. Our sexual recognition center is focused primarily on recognizing people who are of reproductive age or older, who would be, good mates for us to actually have sex with. That's what these sexual recognition centers are supposed to be about. So it's more natural that even a child's emotional brain would find a fully mature person sexually attractive, a person of the gender that their sexual recognition center finds sexy. And some people's sexual recognition center is programmed to find men sexy, and some people's sexual recognition center is programmed to find women sexy. But in either case, our sexual recognition circuitry in the emotional brain is more likely to recognize a sexually mature person as a sexually arousing stimulus. And so there I was with my mother. Now, she was 24 when I was born, and I was 3.5, so she would have been 27.5 at the time we're talking about. And I think for any male who has an emotional brain with recognition centers that are genetically programmed to find women attractive, any male who finds himself naked in a bathtub with a 27.5-year-old woman who is very attractive, is going to be sexually aroused, no matter what age the guy is. And that's certainly what happened to me. I happened to be 3.5 and she was 27.5. So there was a little age difference there. But I don't think age differences should matter in a relationship if both people are attracted to each other. And I mean, I think she found me always very attractive. She was biased as a mother, but I think she always found me just the cutest kid there ever was. And even in my teenage years when I was a gawky, nerdy guy, that didn't matter to her. She could recognize my finest qualities. Okay, she was seeing the best Steve that there could possibly be. So she always felt like I was, hot stuff. Much more so than in reality. She was biased. But anyway. So here I am in the bath with my mom. And see, my own sexual personal history is the only one that I can relate, that I can tell to you. Because I don't know anybody else's sexual history from the inside out. I've read what some people have written in books about their sexual history, but that's a whole different thing from knowing it from the inside out, from feeling it and living through it. So my point in sharing this with you is that this is true. This is all real. See, I'm not making any of this stuff up. I'm not imagining it about somebody else. This is all raw scientific data. Okay, true sexological data. My own personal sex history, the way it really happened, not bullshitting about it, because most of us, first of all, keep our sexual history completely secret, never share it with anybody else, or only share selected portions of our sexual history that we don't mind sharing because they reflect well on us, usually. And so you get a very partial view. So we don't know. None of us knows anybody else's personal sexual history. We can guess at it, but we don't really know it. And it hasn't yet become a habit or a custom in our culture to share our sexual histories, which I think it should be. I think that if all of us went ahead and recorded our sexual history, told it to someone who was a sympathetic listener, who wouldn't say anything much, but just would be there to say, tell me more. Yeah, okay, go on. Explain a little more about that, etc. And would just draw us out. And then we were able to compare our sexual history with someone else's. What would we find? This is an experiment waiting to be done. Nobody's done that yet. And would we find that everybody's sexual history was unique? Absolutely. Absolutely. Nobody, no two of us, have an identical sexual history. So we should not expect any two of us, to have identical sexual preferences, desires, wishes, and enjoyments when we're adults. Every one of us has had a unique sexual history of experiences, like my experience in the tub with my mother. But then, so we'll find that we're all very different and that human sexuality is very diverse, and that's a good thing. And we would be more tolerant of each other, but we would also find that there are plenty of other people out there in a world full of 9 billion people. There are plenty of other people out there who have very similar sexual preferences to ourselves. So we're not alone in any of our sexual preferences, probably. We are unique in the combination of sexual preferences that makes up each one of us, because that depends on our unique genetic heritage, what kind of sexiness recognition centers we have inherited in our emotional brain. That's one factor. And then second, the unique bunch of social sexual experiences that we have had, positive and negative, as we've grown up. Now, my main point here is that our sexual preferences, all of our sexual preferences, are lawful products of learning experiences acting on our genetic emotional brain. Let me say that again, okay. The set of sexual likes and dislikes that we end up with as an individual is going to be the natural product. And I said lawful, meaning it's the product of certain psychological laws, emotional laws of psychology that have been in action during our sexual upbringing and the sexual experiences that we've had. That all of these experiences will act upon our emotional brain and educate our emotional brain in a lawful, predictable way. So we need to know the laws of learning. What's happening here is our emotional brain has had learning experiences as we grew up, some of which were positive and some of which were negative. And if they were positive, then that will encourage us to do whatever it was we were doing that resulted in us feeling that good, because that's what a positive reward is when our emotional consciousness, our consciousness has an emotional tone of euphoria and happiness. That's what it means that an experience is rewarding. But if we've had a rewarding sexual experience and then somebody else comes along who hasn't been a participant in it, a parent, an authority, some other person who comes along and then makes us feel ashamed of ourselves for having had that sexual activity, which we were really enjoying and was rewarding for us, then the reward is followed by shame. Shame is a form of punishment. It's a form of emotional punishment. What shame is making us feel like a bad person, like I'm not a good person because I was sexually active in this particular way. And that this outsider, this non-participant, happened to catch me at it and took it upon themselves to make a judgment about my behavior and punish me for behavior, that didn't involve them. It was my behavior. It wasn't theirs. And it's my body, not theirs. It's my sex drive, not theirs. But they feel they have the social authority to punish me for using my body, my sex drive, in a way that they don't approve of, even though it didn't do anything to bother them. Okay? But, our society has traditionally permitted people like parents and teachers and religious authorities and basically any adult has the authority to punish a child for being sexual, if they catch him. That's been the traditional culture that we've had, and that's why one of the reasons why we needed a counterculture, to critically reject the irrational aspects of the traditional culture. The counterculture means examining every aspect of the received culture, the dinosaur culture, the culture that's on its way to extinction, but just won't give up and is ready to eat us up at any time anyway, even though it's doomed to extinction, and it is the dinosaur culture. It doesn't realize it is. So anyway, if we are the nascent, the newborn counterculture, our job is to examine the customs, the beliefs, the values of the dinosaur culture and show where they are irrational, where they are wrong, where they can be, preserved. Some aspects of culture can be preserved, yes, but there are important aspects that need to be changed, and particularly the aspects that have to do with sexuality and sexual pleasure and sexual acceptance. So part of our counterculture project is to visualize a sex-positive social environment that young people could grow up in that would result in them having strong and healthy sex drives, not filled with guilt, not filled with anxiety, not filled with shame, so that they could have the best possible orgasms, best possible sexual relationships with other people, and enjoy their sexual pleasure system to the max. Well, that would be, what I think we ought to do as a counterculture. But in order to do that, you have to first say, well, is your goal really to help people have the healthiest possible sex drive? Or is your goal to prevent people from having sex unless they happen to be married to each other? See, that's the dinosaurs, the dinosaur culture attitude is, let's try to prevent children and teenagers and unmarried adults from having sex at all, unless they're willing to make a lifelong commitment with one person. And then they could be allowed to have sex. But until then, they should have no sex at all, not even masturbation. Okay, that's the purity culture. And it's not dead at all. And many of you have probably been raised in the purity culture of the evangelical churches. And I was raised in something like that. And so that's why I have made it part of my lifelong project to criticize that sex negative dinosaur culture and visualize a sex positive culture. And so that would mean certain basic assumptions that life is to be lived for ourselves, not for anybody else. We're not trying to please an invisible imaginary being. We're not trying to earn a better afterlife. We accept the fact that consciousness exists for a certain period of time, then it no longer exists, and nothing exists for us for no time at all. Okay? Time stops when consciousness stops. And there's nothing that we can do about that because consciousness is made by our brain. When our brain stops, our field of consciousness is no longer being made, and it simply evaporates. And then we're not bored, we're not unhappy, because we're not experiencing the fact that we're not there. We don't know that we're not there. We don't remember ever having been alive, so we don't regret not being alive anymore. You have to have a consciousness to regret anything. You have to have a consciousness to be bored. So without consciousness, we're completely free from all possible negative feelings at all. There's just simply nothing at all, which is, blissful. But it doesn't last for any time either. And we've all been through it thousands of times in our life because we go through periods of that non-consciousness, that blissful non-consciousness every night when we go to sleep. Several times during the night. We go through exactly what death is like, and we never remember anything about it. Why don't we remember anything about it? It's impossible to notice that you don't have a consciousness. You would have to have a consciousness to notice that you are temporarily without a consciousness, or that you're permanently without a consciousness. You still don't have a consciousness to notice that about. So we can't even notice that we're dead. We're not any of us going to experience even 1 second of being dead, because you can't have experience without consciousness. And that's just the way it is. So we are free to do whatever we want with our lives without having to account to any imaginary being in the sky for what we have done or haven't done. And we are free to make up our own rules about how we live and how we use our sexuality. And all the rules that have ever been championed by certain people saying this is the way you must behave, these are all human rules. They will claim that these are God's rules, but they're not God's rules. They're human rules that were written down in a book and were attributed to God. But no human being has ever known what God likes or doesn't like. We can only imagine that. Or we can imagine that God is talking to us, which is very delusional. But imagining that God is talking to you does not mean that God is talking to you. It just means that your brain is capable of imagining that God is talking to you. And we can imagine all kinds of things in our brain. So all the sexual rules that have ever been made throughout history have been made by human beings. And most of those human beings were living in a pre-scientific age when they didn't understand sex psychologically, biologically, genetically. They didn't know how sex worked. They thought it was some kind of magic. And because it was some kind of magic, they thought that there were invisible spirit beings that were in control of it and that, wanted us to use sex in only a certain way because it was a magic function. Sex is not a magic function. Sex is a completely natural biological function. Now, scientifically, we understand that. And so now we can make guidelines for our own sexual behavior using scientific knowledge about sex and not being worried about pleasing anybody except those of us who are actually engaged in the situation that is occurring. We don't need to be pleasing anybody else. Sex is not a spectator sport. We're not doing sex for the benefit of an audience of any sort. But that's a hard thing to get into our consciousness if we have been raised with a religious upbringing and we've been taught to imagine that God is looking at us all the time. It's hard to get that God, that Jesus, whoever the onlooker, the imaginary onlooker is, out of our consciousness. It's very hard to do that. It takes discipline, and it's a necessary thing to do. It's a necessary thing to do for complete sexual relaxation and for relaxed sexual arousal. Because we don't want to have any emotional inner tension, and that's what we get. That's what we got from a religious upbringing, was we were taught that there were imaginary onlookers who were shaming us, wagging their finger at us, shaming us for being sexual, even though we were doing nothing but creating happiness for ourselves. So that's why, if we're going to have really sex-positive lives, it's important for us to think about what our sexual values are, why we hold those values, and to feel completely convinced that we are correct in having sex-positive values. All we're talking about is using our own natural sex drive to generate as much euphoric sexual consciousness as we can for ourselves and for anyone else who happens to be participating with us. And we need to do it intelligently so that we don't create unpleasant after effects, STDs or unwanted pregnancy, or making somebody jealous and breaking their heart and ruining a relationship that we cherish. So we have to be intelligent pleasurologists. And to do that, it's important that we look at sexuality as it really is and accept it as it really is in all of its diversity, in all of its wildness, and that it's so much more diverse and more, there's so much more potential for pleasure than the received culture, the traditional culture, has allowed us to see, because the traditional culture has so narrowly defined acceptable sexual behavior. So my sharing my sexual history with you is an attempt to give you at least a view into one other human being's sexual development as honestly as I can possibly present it. So I'll continue with that next time. Thanks for listening. Talk to you again soon.